Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars. We're pleased to welcome you to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website and those that will be joining us on C-SPAN TV today. We would ask everyone in-house if you'll be so kind to see that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And we will, of course, post our program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference following our presentation today. Opening our session is Jennifer Marshall. Ms. Marshall serves as our Vice President for the Institute for Family and Community and Opportunity. She oversees our research areas that determine the character of culture, education, marriage, family, religion, and civil society. She also heads our Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. She manages our familyfacts.org online source for the latest social science on those issues. And prior to joining us here, she worked both at Empower America and as Senior Director of Family Studies at the Family Research Council. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Marshall. Jennifer?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for being here for this conversation about opportunity in America. We're really pleased to debut this Index of Culture and Opportunity. And here with me on stage is David Azarad, my colleague at the Heritage Foundation. He directs the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. And the reason we wanted to start the conversation here today is that David, along with our colleague Ryan Anderson at Heritage, contributed the introductory essay to the Index of Culture and Opportunity. And before we got into the 31 indicators of culture and opportunity and whether those indicators are opening the doors or closing the doors to the horizons for all Americans, we wanted to set the stage with what our concept and idea of opportunity was as a whole. And David and Ryan did a really great job of that. And we wanted to talk about a few of those ideas today. David and I are going to take about 10 minutes to do so before our main panel comes up. And I'm very pleased to have my former colleague and co-editor for this project, Ray Hederman, here to be the moderator for that panel. Ray is the Executive Vice President of the Buckeye Institute in Ohio, and it will be leading 3 of our contributors to this project in a conversation about how what opportunity is and how we can grow it in this country. But let me start here with a conversation with you, David, by asking, you've made the observation, obviously, that the premise behind this index is that we have the interrelation of economic and social issues. In fact, you remarked that that's the first line of page 1 of this index. Can you tell me a little bit about, you're somebody who looks at the founders and founding principles. Can you tell me from your perspective how you think they would have looked at this conversation today that we sometimes have between economic and social principles?
Yeah, I think they would have found it strange that people label themselves based on a particular subset of issues they care about and say, this is what I care about, and this is going to be my governing philosophy. I think the founders, being statesmen, had a much more holistic approach, and their concern, I mean, they told us in what is, without a doubt, I think the most beautiful line in the Constitution. It's the last reason in the preamble for why we have a Constitution: to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and this is the key part, to our posterity. There's a concern when you're founding a regime to set it up in such a way that it will endure. Not just that you will be able to enjoy your liberties right now, but that there will be a next generation, and more importantly, that this next generation too, they will also be capable of enjoying the blessings of liberty. And this is how I think we should start to think about the family and these, I don't like the word social issues. It implies that these are issues that matter only to religious people or traditionalists. I think the founders would have understood the family as a core political issue. And maybe to translate it in wonkier DC terms, the social and economic issues in this regard are deeply intertwined. The core conservative project is to limit the size, scope, and reach of the government. Well, what's going to come in and take that place? So you want to limit something, what's going to expand and fill in the void? It has to be self-governing individuals and a vibrant civil society. And how do you produce self-governing individuals? What is the cornerstone of a vibrant civil society? It's families. A defensive marriage serves the ends of limited government more effectively, less intrusively, and at a less cost than trying to pick up the broken pieces of a shattered marriage culture.
So opportunity is not necessarily a word that we find on every other page of the founders, but you would argue, I think, that it's embedded in their writings. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, you don't really see references to opportunity, and equality of opportunity, which has become the rhetorical linchpin of the right in America, is really a 20th century term, and it begins to appear in the late 19th century, but it's not the language that the founders used. That said, it is embedded right there in the Declaration of Independence. Once you proclaim that all men are created equal, what you're in effect saying is denying the fundamental premise of every aristocratic regime. You're throwing the Ancien regime out the window. You're saying that actually your lot in life is not fixed at birth. If all men are created equal, it means you're free to pursue happiness as you see fit. And that means that you're going to need opportunities to pursue that happiness, to pursue a career of your choosing, to marry who you want, to worship God according to the dictates of your conscience. You need to open up opportunities for people to live out their lives as they see fit. That's not necessary under the Ancien regime in an aristocracy, because you're born somewhere, you'll practice a certain profession, you don't get to move, and that's it. So embedded in this idea of equality is the notion of opportunity.
So what is the source of opportunity? Where does it come from? How should we think about this?
I think that's a great question. You know, some on the left will say that it's government spending, that they like to say that we need to invest in opportunity, and that means pumping more money into the economy to create jobs. I think the proper way to think about it on the right is twofold. One is, will be known use to anybody, is free markets. I think everybody knows that already. I mean, what free markets do is that they create these opportunities for you to hone in on a particular product that doesn't exist, a service that doesn't exist, or a better way to do something. That's not very controversial. The other thing I would like to emphasize, and I guess to remind a conservative audience, is that opportunities not only come from markets, they also come from the rich network of human connections we have. They come from the people we know, from the communities we belong to. And one very important source of opportunity in people's lives is being part of thriving communities. And one problem we have in many areas for people who have a deficit of opportunity is not only are there few economic opportunities available to them, civil society has broken down, and it really becomes a society of disjointed individuals rather than interconnected individuals.
So we've heard the metaphor of a ladder of opportunity quite a bit. But one of the words that comes up in the conversation that I've had with you about opportunity is capacity quite a bit, that it takes something more to grab hold of that ladder. So can you talk to that issue a little bit?
Yeah, so we love this metaphor that the American dream is about a ladder of opportunity that you need to climb. Well, what does it take to climb that ladder? I would appeal to one of my favorite Americans, who I think is one of the greatest apostles of upward mobility that this country has ever seen, Frederick Douglass. He gave a famous speech on self-made men. And what was the recipe? What was the recipe to their success? His answer was a simple one. Work, 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 work. Not transient and fitful effort, but patient, enduring, honest, unremitting, and indefatigable work into which the whole heart is put, and in which both temporal and spiritual matters is the true miracle worker. As Franklin put it in a letter to aristocrats who were interested in moving to America, he said, "America is the land of labor. Here we work." I don't know if any of you watch Downton Abbey, and there's a famous scene where the grandmother says, "A job? What is a job? That's not something we do." This is not the American ethos. If anything, you may say we work too hard, we don't take enough vacation. So work has to be a cornerstone of an opportunity worldview. The other things that are important are obviously character, grit, and determination, and I'm rather encouraged in this regard to see that the left is starting to talk about these things. For the longest time, there seemed to be a divide that conservatives would talk about character and virtue, and the left was more interested in solutions that dealt with programs and transferring money. I find it encouraging to hear more and more voices on the other side acknowledging the importance of character. And lastly, of course, and rather obviously, is education. And having a solid education with the skills you'll acquire to climb that ladder of opportunity. But I would prioritize them in that order: work, character, education.
Opportunity doesn't necessarily have the same ring to everybody who hears it. What do we do about that?
Yeah, so conservatives, like I said, and libertarians for that matter, have made opportunity the rhetorical linchpin of our governing vision. And I think that's excellent, and it appeals to many people, and it very much is in keeping with our traditions. I think we should remind ourselves on the right to also speak of security once in a while. That the opportunity message will appeal to many, but that there's something unsettling about opportunity. There's something unsettling about markets, about the churning that they produce. And the left is very good at alleviating the concerns of people who feel insecure. And I think we have much to offer in this regard. I mean, we believe in a strong safety net. We recognize that people fall on hard times and that they need to be taken care of. I think conservatives and libertarians need to remind themselves to keep opportunity at the forefront, but remind yourselves once in a while, or ourselves, pardon me, to speak of security and to address these concerns too.
Thank you so much, David, for joining me here to kick this conversation off.
Thank you.
We're going to exit the stage and ask the next panel to come up. While they do so, I'll just make a couple of other comments. As you can see, David Azarad and Ryan Anderson's essay helped us to shape an outlook on opportunity that looks at it as the capacity to enjoy the blessings of liberty today and to be able to pass them on to the next generation. That's a critical goal for us in the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity, which we launched here at Heritage in June of this year. The Index of Culture and Opportunity is the flagship publication of that institute, and it was launched in July. The contributors, the panelists that you see here today, were all contributors to that, and my former colleague and good friend Ray Hederman, who is now Executive Vice President of the Buckeye Institute in Ohio, was co-editor of the whole project with me. Very glad to have his partnership in it. And he is now going to lead a conversation with three of our contributors to the volume. So over to you, Ray.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, David, for that great introduction and kind of laying the groundwork for what we hope is a provocative discussion on why culture and opportunity are linked and why it matters. I think, let me go through my panelists. On my immediate left is Steve Moore. Steve is the current chief economist at the Heritage Foundation. His second stint at Heritage, he was back at the Heritage back in the 80s before he decamped to the Cato Institute, research director of President Reagan's Privatization Commission, senior economist of the U.S. Joint Economic Committee, most recently was on the Wall Street Journal editorial board. So I know Heritage is glad to have Steve back in his role of chief economist. In the middle is Heather McDonald. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of the City Journal. She is also the recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize for Outstanding Intellectual Achievement. She's worked on many different issues at City Journal covering homeland security, immigration, policing, homelessness, education policies, families, and business improvement districts. To her immediate left, to the far left, last but certainly not least, is another former Heritage colleague of mine, Chuck Donovan. So Charles Donovan is the president of the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Before that, he was the legislative director of the National Right to Life Committee. He also worked as a speechwriter for President Reagan and helped lead the Family Research Council for nearly 2 decades, and previously was the senior research fellow in religion and civil society here at the Heritage Foundation. And as Jennifer mentioned, they are all key writers and contributors to our index, taking a look at an indicator and say, what does this indicator mean? How does it fit into the overall scope of culture and opportunity, and why is it important? Well, the index focuses on 2 things, culture and opportunity. What do we mean by culture? In this definition, we're laying out saying, let us measure the health of American families, the education system, our religious and civil institutions. Opportunity looks at things such as what type of educational achievement are our students getting? How likely are you to find work? What are the chances of starting your own businesses? And you still have the opportunity to be successful in business as you were in the past. Now I want to take you back in time to about 20 years ago when then Vice President Dan Quayle was embarked in a dispute with a minor TV character named Murphy Brown over the role of single motherhood. And this was considered a key part of the cultural wars. You had the sitting president of the United States in a silly debate with a television character. But now you're starting to see, and I would argue that you're starting to see a little bit more of a consensus saying that maybe the Murphy Brown wars about single motherhood shouldn't be lumped in just the culture war argument, but there's a very important economic component as well. Consider the work on the right of somebody like Charles Murray at the American Enterprise Institute in Coming Apart that takes a look and says, family breakdown is occurring upon people who didn't go to college. While college-educated elites, marriage is a very stable and growing institution, is very strong by comparison. Then take a look most recently this summer, Isabel Sawhill at the Brookings Institute wrote a book entitled Generation Unbound, looking at how the rise of single motherhood is harming the economic prospects for a lot of young women. And now just Monday, the Washington Post, Robert Samuelson wrote a piece that entitled The Family Deficit in the Washington Post, taking a look saying there are economic problems that are arising as we see the breakdown of family and culture. So I guess, my question is, are we coming to consensus where maybe cultural issues is impacting economic opportunity? Is the left coming on board like David alluded to? What has changed the discussion since Murphy Brown to where you have, Brookings talking about the breakdown of the family?
Well, Ms. Sawhill has been a leader in understanding the catastrophe that is the rise of single parenting. So I don't think that she's necessarily indicative of a change, and I think we've still got a lot of ground to conquer in spreading the understanding as widely as possible of the relationship between family breakdown and poverty, say. I still see the classic story on the New York Times complaining about poverty and the difficulty that poor families are having getting by. It is almost never pointed out explicitly that what they're talking about is single mothers. And I'm also concerned on the other side that Republicans are starting to talk about single mothers as if they were ontological categories. In campaign speeches, you hear the pitch to single mothers as if they simply exist by some kind of fiat, divine fiat, as opposed to being the product of choice. And I think that the real key is personal responsibility, and we have to make the message that gets harder and harder to make, send it out, that fathers are absolutely crucial to their children, and feminism makes that very difficult. So it's a constant battle.
I would add one perspective to that. Robert Rector writes, I think brilliantly in the index of indicators about the course of welfare over the last 40 years. And he shifts the argument to the question of self-sufficiency rather than increase in poverty. And we tend to talk about single mothers, and I think the instinctive reaction I have to that is that a bit of finger-pointing and blaming? This is the person who has stayed with the situation, which wasn't ideal, is raising the child. Isn't it a case that she's the single mother present, and yet you have a single father too? He's absent. And we have to begin to account, I think, for the full picture of why that single father is absent. I think certainly radical feminism is part of that. You could even say to a certain degree the pro-life movement, of which I'm a part, which urges through pregnancy help centers and provides means for single mothers to have their children. We basically, though, have a flight from responsibility. And I think at the end of the day, we're not only damaging self-sufficiency, we're damaging a deeper notion of resilience. In any economy, certainly the one we have now, where there are ups and downs, we've had a recession under a conservative administration, we've had growth under a liberal administration, we have policies that punish success, that punish enterprise. I think we have a spreading pessimism. I see it in dozens of other indicators about the future. And what a family gives you, an intact family gives you, is a sense that whatever harm comes, you've got layers of resilience that can help you rebound and also help you achieve your goals. But I think we can spread the blame pretty widely for this attitude of, I think, diminishing responsibility and diminishing hope.
So Steve, you're our economist, and so last Friday, Federal Reserve Board Chairman Janet Yellen, mentioned inequality in a speech up in Boston. You hear Elizabeth Warren, elected senator from Massachusetts. President Obama has talked a lot about income inequality, where income inequality is a huge threat to opportunity, that middle class are struggling to get by, and we're not seeing, the American dream achievable for a lot of people, particularly born at the bottom. So, are we looking at it, is the economy, is income inequality an economic problem? What is kind of going on here?
Well, I want to just first point out that I think there is a lot of reason for optimism. I think a lot of these positions that we've been taking about, the fact that parenthood matters and then having a father in the home matters, I think that's becoming more accepted. But then, you see what Hillary Clinton said on Friday, where she made this absurd statement that businesses and corporations don't create jobs, and you know, I think maybe we're not making the progress that we thought we were in terms of these common sense things. And by the way, that is related to this because, you know, one of the things you find in your excellent report is that, you know, we have seen a decline in entrepreneurship and business creation. And maybe that's because there's a kind of war against business on the left that I find is extremely destructive. So I wanted to get that off my chest because it you know, just happened a few days ago. But look, I am an economist. I deal with tax rates as you do, Ray, and I deal with, you know, the labor force issues and elasticities and things like that. But, you know, I read the entire speech. I read the entire speech that Janet Yellen gave, and she talks in great length about income inequality. You know what's interesting? She never brought up any of these issues of culture and family. And, you know, as I look at the data and the evidence, obviously I think that what tax rates and all these other things matter. But there are two things that really are the key to reducing poverty. A free enterprise system, which is, you know, I think we'd all accept. But the second is a non-economic factor. Marriage. Marriage is the best anti-poverty program out there. It's much, much more effective than the hundreds of billions of dollars we've spent, you know, trying to combat poverty with welfare programs. So I've kind of come to the conclusion that when you look at people at the bottom of the income scale, those people in the bottom that we call poor, that are in that bottom 20%, a huge percentage of them come from broken families. And the other thing that's interesting about people at the bottom, Ray, is a point that you kind of alluded to earlier, is that when you look at those people in the bottom 20%, over half of those households have no one working. So if no one was working in the household, how in the world can they get out of poverty, right? I mean, if no one, now you could just give them money, which the government does, but you're not doing really anything to lift their lives. And I just want to kind of square the circle by saying, goes back to what David and Jennifer were talking about getting on the economic and climbing up it. Right. Well, Ray, if no one is working in the household, you're not on the first rung of the economic ladder. If you don't get on the first rung, you don't get on the second, third, and fourth, and fifth. And so I would say that, you know, that's why work is important and marriage is important.
And I would say, again, we need to find the language again to valorize fathers. And it's boys who are hurt the most if they don't have a father in the house. Of course, there's wonderful single mothers that are doing the best they can, and many of them are heroically raising children who are capable of seizing opportunity. But on average, males and females bring different gifts to raising children, and boys do need their fathers. And what they learn are some of those other bourgeois virtues that we don't always talk about, which is so important to being able to seize the opportunity that is out there, which is self-discipline, deferred gratification, being able to realize that you've got to study at night rather than going out and partying or hanging out on the street selling drugs. And so I think one of the chapters in here talks about drug use. Sobriety is also a very important virtue that is necessary for building the civil society that David and Jennifer spoke of. So I think it gets harder and harder to find that language to say, no, women are strong, but they can't do it all. We need fathers as well.
Let me just add something to this. You know, there is this great chapter on drug use. And look, I'm a libertarian. I mean, I feel like what people do in their own, you know, house is their own business and so on. But it's interesting, you know, I've been doing a lot of work with a guy named Bob Funk, who runs the biggest employment agency in America, and employs 400,000 people a year. So he probably employs more than anyone, any private sector employer in the country. And he's been telling me consistently that, look, there are jobs out there. I mean, this idea that there are jobs out there for people who have skills. But he was saying, just as an example, that they had a recent opening for 500 employees at a new factory, and they got something like, I don't remember the exact number, like 6,000 applications. And out of those 6,000 people, Heather, he said, over half of them couldn't pass a drug test.
Well, if you've got half the people who can't drug attest, they're not going to get employed. They're not employable. And that's an example of this being a kind of cultural problem, not an economic problem.
The meth problem is very scary. I mean, I think that's the one thing that Charles Murray didn't talk about in his book that he well could have, is that's what's happening in the lower stratum of our economy at this point, is this very scary spread of meth use. And it is completely handicapping people in their ability to seize the opportunities that are out there.
You hear about the, Steve, I was wondering if that company was located in Ohio, because we've seen a lot of the business reports saying, middle America, blue collar America, heavy manufacturing, you have a lot of companies that do want to hire, and you have a lot of people out of work, but because of some of these cultural factors, businesses aren't able to hire somebody for trustworthy jobs, because of drug use, personal responsibility. Well, when we did the index, we laid out the cultural section. We tried to walk through there's 3 different sections. The first takes a look at just pure culture, then starts moving in to more kind of personal responsibility. Then we end with opportunity. Yep. And we laid that out a little bit for a reason. And so my question is there a chicken and egg? Do you need a strong culture to be able to build strong opportunities? Is this kind of how vital is to us to keep our strong civil institutions to maintain kind of the economic growth and prosperity that America's enjoyed?
Well, let me give you an example of how culture, and I meaning culture in a very broad sense right now, affects our economy. So you're right, there are millions of jobs out there that are being unfilled. And there's a kind of new kind of cultural dimension to the idea that blue-collar work is not acceptable. Blue-collar work is for immigrants and other people. And look, blue-collar work is tough work, so there's no question about it. But we have millions of jobs that could be filled by people with 2 years of junior college, getting some kind of apprenticeship, getting a vocational skill. And if you're good at those kinds of things, you can rise up. You can start as a welder or a carpenter or an electrician, and then you can become the foreman. And these are not low-paying jobs we're talking about. These are jobs that pay $60, $70, $80, sometimes $100,000 a year, and they are going unfilled. And it's partly, my point is, this is partly attitudinal. No, American workers, you don't get your hands dirty anymore. And actually, we need workers who have skills, who can make things and fix things. And I think the reason those jobs aren't being filled is a kind of cultural issue, that it's beneath the American worker to do that.
I would say there's a schizophrenia in the right. We occasionally hear people speaking, as Steve does, absolutely accurately about the nobility of all kinds of work. At the same time, conservatives have gotten sucked into the mantra as well that everybody should go to college. And I know so many well-meaning philanthropists in New York City who are running programs for inner city kids, and their measure of success is invariably how many kids they're sending to college. Now that's obviously, it's a good thing to go to college, especially if you're going to college out of a passion for learning. And when you're there, it's a good thing if you realize that this is your best opportunity to read the Greek tragedies and Shakespeare and George Eliot and learn the periodic table and be filled with a joy. But it is not necessary to go to college to have a productive life. And the more we have this idea that you are a failure unless you've gone to college, we're going to water down the academic standards of college so much, as is already going on, that it's virtually meaningless. So I think that we have to get our message straight here and not
yeah, and this is an attitudinal problem that's almost more prevalent on the right than it is on the left.
I think there's the whole question of motivation for work as well. And I believe theologically and socially in the value of work and nobility of labor and the need for a drug-free workplace. I walked past a construction site this morning. The first thing you see is a ladder leading down to a 20-foot pit, and next to it is a sign is, "This is a drug-free workplace." Sort of self-explanatory. But I do think for the vast majority of people, certainly in the era of the 1950s to 1970s, low tax, high employment, booming economic growth, a Democratic president cutting taxes, family formation through the roof, at least post-war. The motivation for work while it was noble to make a good jet engine for GE, if you go there, it was noble to make good soap at Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, where I grew up. Most of the people who went to work because of what happened at 6 o'clock at night. They brought home a paycheck to a spouse, to a family, and they viewed their lives and their work lives as serving these almost higher goods, maybe higher goods, of family, of church, of community. And I think when a community lacks this kind of broad resilience, and obviously we have communities in the country where the single motherhood or the out-of-wedlock birth rate is 70% plus, the question of what are you working for becomes, I think, a pretty subtle one of inspiration and motivation. Because while we do noble things at work, I think the tradition for most people is what I get to this is my other life, what I bring home to it. And I think that those deficits there tie culture directly to economic opportunity.
You know, Chuck, you mentioned kind of, the communities and kind of what ties communities together. And I think one thing that's been kind of in the news a lot, and I think, Heather, you wrote about this, is crime, and about how you think about crime in kind of many different areas, but you don't think about kind of what the reverse of crime is safe neighborhoods. And if you want to try to have good communities with opportunity, you need to have a place for safety. And I see some writings, again, a bipartisan issue where people on the left saying great social programs, the left wants to interact. Doesn't work if societies aren't safe and communities aren't, well policed and crime rate down. I mean, what's the story on kind of crime?
The story on crime is absolutely mysterious, puzzling, fascinating, because it contradicts both the liberal and the conservative memes about how to fight crime and how society works. The liberal story about crime is that it's a product of inequality, of poverty, of racism, and that you cannot solve crime, you cannot lower crime, unless you get rid of poverty, racism, inequality. And therefore, we need large social programs. And the left is always pushed back against law enforcement, wanting to do big government instead. Conservatives, such as myself, will say, we cannot expect to live in safe communities when you have this catastrophe of family breakdown, when you have boys being raised without any expectation that they will be expected to show the basic, most fundamental aspect of personal responsibility, which is raising their own children. Both sides were wrong. We have had, since the early 1990s, the largest and most sustained crime drop on record. Nobody predicted it. It's defied every criminologist's expectations. And what did not change radically was the level of inequality and poverty in this country, nor did family breakdown improve. So both liberals and conservatives were wrong. What changed? Primarily, in my opinion, what made it the difference was effective policing. This was a revolution that came out of New York City that held police commanders accountable for the crime in their neighborhoods. They studied data every single day. They made policing efficient. They went after crime patterns when they were breaking out. They took care of quality of life, which is civility offenses. What's happening on the city streets that make people feel like they're living in a chaotic, disorderly environment. And we did have a prison increase. Now, this is a very controversial topic now. There's a lot of discourse about the negative effects of mass incarceration. Conservatives are jumping on the bandwagon here. I would caution them because I think that the incarceration buildup did play a very significant role in dropping crime by incapacitating criminals. The way this plugs into opportunity is now you have businesses that are able to open up in neighborhoods without worrying about the safety of their employees. You have people able to shop at night. Restaurants opened up. New York City was transformed, and the crime drop is what preceded the economic activity. The one thing that conservatives are right about, it's not that you need the booming economy to get rid of crime. You lower crime, and that allows economic activity to flourish. And that's what we saw in New York, and that's spreading in other cities.
Just
as well.
one kind of point of clarification is, You know, you're right. There's a rethinking of fighting crime on the right. That's a big deal now. But it seems to me has to do with nonviolent criminals. And it seems to me there's a kind of thinking about, should we treat a drug user differently than we should, armed robbery? You know, someone who's invading your private. And that's an interesting debate that was really emerging on our side, whether the criminal justice system is creating a class of criminals, of people who's 19 years old who were involved in some kind of nonviolent offense. The jury is out on that, but I agree with you. When it comes to people who are convicted of a violent crime, put them away, and that's one of the best ways of cleaning up the streets. I wonder whether you would make that distinction between nonviolent versus violent criminals.
Prison remains a Lifetime Achievement Award for persistence in criminal offending. Mm-hmm. It is not the case that there are harmless marijuana smokers that are in prison. You have to work very hard before a district attorney says, okay, I'm actually going to throw you in the slammer. It's extremely disturbing as a layperson to hear the worldview of district attorneys and what they consider serious and non-serious offenses. The non-serious ones are the ones they're not going to prosecute, such as stealing a car. Now, I submit, if your car is stolen, that's kind of serious. But in the district attorney's eyes, it only becomes serious if you actually use a gun to steal it. In other words, hijack it with somebody in the car itself. So the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of people in prison are there for violent and property crimes. The increase in prison population for at least the last 10 years has been exclusively from violent and property crimes. And I would also just bring up something as a sort of prophylactically. The other element of this is the idea that drug laws are racist and that they're responsible for the disproportion of blacks in prison. Well, blacks are 37.5% of the state prison population, which is where the majority of prisoners are. 88% of all prisoners are in the state prison population. If you remove all drug offenders from the state prison population, the percentage of black offenders in prison drops from 37.5% to 37%. So there's not much effect there. And when you go to an inner city police community neighborhood, this is what you will hear every single time. We want the drug dealers off the corners. You arrest them, they're back the next day. Why can't you keep them off the streets? The reason the police are enforcing the drug laws is because that's what the community wants.
I will say, though, that to me it's pretty plain that most parents will want their children to avoid having to have the police be their source of inspiration to abide by the law. This is really where the home functions, with both the mother and father in agreement on some general rules like not being out at 2 in the morning because nothing good typically happens at 2 in the morning. and we want children to internalize the rules. So to the extent that my children were involved in the police, they were told what to say to the officer, please and thank you, basically. They didn't have their rights violated. They had internalized the laws before the encounter. That is what you want to have happen. And in too many communities, that father or mother is not there in the home when the moment of inspiration to possibly commit a crime happens.
So let me touch on a point I think, Heather, you talked to about kind of the idea that you had a breakdown in communities because there wasn't enough, a little bit of kind of economic opportunity with big spending. And so, Chuck, you hear a lot about this is that if there was more economic opportunity, you'd have more marriageable males, that the family broke down because there wasn't enough economic opportunity. I mean, is that a fair kind of critique of kind of the economic prosperity of the nation, that we didn't create enough jobs, and that's kind of what led to the downturn of the family?
Well, Steve's already cited the number of jobs that are out there, but they're at a skill level or a commitment level where the individuals are not poised to take advantage of it. I think it's a question of too few chickens and too few eggs. The ability to seize an opportunity is about resilience, as I say. It's also about a little bit of push. I mean, my parents, not to get too personal again, But the idea that we could spend a day out of the home and not have done something useful, or that it would be reported back to them that we had been rude to the person at the local community grocery store, they wouldn't have had to hear about that directly from the grocery store owner. They would have heard it from the other 7 customers in the store who knew the Donovan children and got the word back. The community has to have a kind of coherence so that there's this level of self-control and self-restraint that combines with an inspiration to work and the duty to work and a responsibility, someone who depends on you. They say among soldiers, for example, that when you go out on the battlefield, nobody dies for their country. They don't die for the king. They die for the guy next to them. They fight for the guy next to them because they have that bond. And I'm afraid with the fraying of family and community, we're asking people to become these insular individuals who somehow see achievement in the workplace as something they can self-generate. I don't think that's how people work.
You know, not working is a learned behavior, right? And so we see that, you know, we know this, that, you know, second generation children of parents on welfare are more likely to be on welfare. And dependency is a kind of learned behavior. And the one thing that I had to get out there is, you know, for those of you who know me, you know I'm very critical of Barack Obama. I'm very critical of his economic programs. But there's one thing that is extremely admirable about Barack Obama, which is, by all accounts, he's a great father and a great husband. And that, I get so frustrated that he doesn't. We need more role models, and especially, you know, we know that family breakup is much more prevalent in the black community than is the white community. I mean, I just wish that the president would play that role of the role model more effectively than he does, because I think he can change lives in a very productive way if he would do that. Whereas our culture kind of glorifies single family households. I mean, look at TV and the movies and things like that, and that does have an impact.
And on your question, Ray, about the conventional argument that William Julius Wilson made, that it was the lack of economic opportunity that led to crime and other problems of the inner city, I think Mr. Donovan has started to rebut that. And I would add that what we saw in the Great Depression was an economic catastrophe that fortunately we still have not repeated to that full extent, but horrible joblessness, worklessness, poverty, and crime was very low. Whereas in the 1960s, you had a very robust economy, and crime started going through the roof. So crime really is a cultural issue. It's about the rule of law, whether people have been given the values to respect the rule of law, whether they have the family orientation of that self-control and deferred gratification, and the family structure that will say, no, you do not steal just because you want something. So we're all agreeing very heavily on this panel, but I still think the message is not out there enough that family structure is the most important thing. And America is suffering from it more than other European countries. And I think that unless we can figure out a way to rebuild the family at all income structures, we're going to have a very hard time with our economy.
Before we conclude and leave, I want to leave time for questions, but let me just ask one question for each of you. If you could take a look at one trend, that we illustrate that highlights either culture or opportunity, what do you think kind of you'd like to put your finger on and say, this is a good indication of where we're going, and are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And I'll start with you, Steve.
So that's a great question. And I'm going to go with labor force participation rate, which is something you touched on in this, because I think it does get to the issue of people not accepting the whole concept we talked about the dignity of work. And I just want to put one kind of fine point on this. I think it would be a good thing if younger people worked more. And it's interesting if you say this. I remember in Maine, the Republican governor wanted to make some changes to the work rules so to make it easier for young people to work. And I'm talking about teenagers. And my God, the left went crazy. I mean, like, oh my God, he's trying to repeal the child labor laws and so on and so forth. And I've been looking at the statistics on this, and it turns out that the younger someone starts working, it's a pretty good lead indicator of how successful they are over their life. So this idea that we shouldn't have 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds working, that's crazy. It's a good thing to get them working, you know, instead of in front of a computer screen or a TV screen. And it gets to the idea of why the minimum wage is such a horrible, horrible idea, because you're actually denying, you know, the work opportunities of people who are young. And just one last thing on this, I know we're running out of time. I've said this a million times, but it's so important because I think everyone can kind of, one of the most important jobs I ever had was my first job, you know, and it was a minimum wage job, you know, and you learn basic skills. You learn how to show up for work on time, how to be nice to your boss, you know, how to run a cash register, and those things stay with you for life. So this cultural idea that it's a bad thing for young people to work is completely wrong. It's a good thing. Parents out there, get your kids out there working. It'll pay off in life in spades over time.
Insightful point on the minimum wage and the impact on youth unemployment. You know, a
Yeah,
new
there's no
study
question
came
about
out, National Bureau of Economic
Yeah,
Research,
right,
higher minimum
exactly.
wage. Heather.
Well, I would keep an eye on crime. I mean, we have had this extraordinary crime drop that has freed up more opportunities in poor inner city neighborhoods. And we should be able to keep it going as long as we keep policing strong. We're living now in a moment of very scary delegitimation of policing with the idea that cops are racist, which I reject entirely. There are bad cops, there are impolite cops, there are cops with an attitude that need constant retraining, but by and large, they're going where crime is, and they're going to help people that are being most victimized, and that's in inner city neighborhoods. But we're seeing now shootings across the country against cops because of the reign of Al Sharpton and a very poisonous rhetoric out there. And when people start shooting at cops, that's a real worry sign for the rule of law and civilization.
Shooting at cops literally or figuratively?
Well,
because it's happening both ways, right?
Right.
You know.
That being said, just to repeat myself again, and probably Mr. Donovan will agree, I think if we could reverse the inexorable rise of out-of-wedlock childbearing, that would be the most important thing we could do for our culture. And it seems to be just unstoppable. But if we could get more people to say the best thing, more mothers to say the best thing I can do for my child is to give him his father, and more fathers to say I have an indefeasible responsibility to raise my child, that would be the best thing that could happen for our country.
Well, to me, it's absolutely the marriage rate. And Brad Wilcox's article in the Index makes it screamingly clear. There's been a 10-point reduction in the marriage rate in the last decade. What astonished me, looking at his numbers again, is that it's been 50% since the year of the 1970s. And we all talk about out-of-wedlock childbearing. The childbearing is not the problem. We are below replacement rate, birth rate in the United States. Only 2 years of the last 42 have we been above replacement, even with the influence of immigrants to the country. It's the out-of-wedlock thing. And I'll add one last point to that. Out of personal experience, I imagine there's some in the audience too. When young people come out of college and they're doing what we consider pursuing the American dream in the right way, and their initial experience is a debt that's larger than the mortgage of their parents, we have a problem. It's not the only reason. I think the romantic and cultural ones are bigger, but it is among the reasons why marriage is becoming a more difficult proposition. And it's forcing people, I think, to consider they might have to make it on their own, when in truth, we make it a lot better with a partner. Shakespeare, every drama ends with a marriage. There's a reason.
Right. Fantastic. At that point, I'd like to open up for questions from the audience for any of the panels or any of the topics that we've discussed today. So are there any questions?
Hello, my name is Ovid Lamont. I am General Counsel for Americans United for Life, and I want to thank you and the Heritage Foundation for this fine publication and really focusing on the connectedness between the culture and economic opportunity in America. I was struck when I was reading the index by what I believe to be a root cause of the moral decay we've experienced in America over the last 40 years, and that's America's extreme abortion policy. I think it's error by omission if we don't look at what's happened with respect to our abortion policy and see the unintended consequences to undermine the family unit, to undermine what we consider to be traditional American values. And so I would ask you to comment on whether or not you think changing the abortion policy, and Chuck, thank you for writing the piece in the index about trends on abortion specifically, whether or not that can help to strengthen the family, strengthen our culture, and thereby lead to economic prosperity in America.
Well, you know, look at the statistics in the book, and I think you came up with some of these. You know, the abortion rate has been declining, and the number of abortions has been declining. And I think that obviously, I think everybody would agree that's a very, very good thing, that the number of abortions is on the decline. And the point I would make about that, the laws haven't changed much really in the last 25 or 30 years with respect to abortion. I think where conservatives are winning, and you may disagree with this, that we're winning this kind of moral fight, but I think it's because, as Steve Forbes used to say when he ran for president, the way we're going to win the abortion fight is to change the hearts and minds of the American people. And you know what? I think we are changing the hearts and minds of the American people. The whole idea of abortion stops a beating heart. I think that's a message that has really resonated with people. There was the campaign a number of years ago, just life, what a beautiful thing. Well, I forget how it went. What a beautiful, just showing pictures of babies. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is an area where we're improving culturally because we have changed the minds of a lot of people. I don't know, am I wrong on that, Heather? Or?
Chuck, you wrote the indicator.
Well, the indicator shows a 20% decline over the last 10-year period studied in the report. It's a little bit bigger than that over the longer term. I think it's a good thing. We have, obviously a good thing. We have a radical abortion policy in the United States, as your question suggested. We are one of 4 nations on the planet. You can include among the 4 North Korea and China to get a sense of the kind of regime that endorses it, that essentially has a policy of legal abortion until birth. And I think it has influenced the judgment of men not to take up their responsibilities because, after all, the woman has a 9-month period where she can relieve him of this responsibility. So this life of a human being, which hangs in the balance, is a subject of barter and debate. We have battles over the child in the womb. Well, if we can do that, we can have battles over everything. You talked at the beginning, I think it was David, about securing the blessings of liberty. What has made us less secure than abortion on demand? What has made relationships between men and women less secure, less significant in some way than abortion on demand? It's her problem. And the statistics are, in many respects, grim. 50% repeat abortion rates. Imagine what if those numbers were added to the out-of-wedlock birth rate, which we wouldn't like that to happen, but those numbers would be 60 to 70%. We haven't been brought to a place of peace or prosperity by this policy. We've been brought to a place of irresponsibility to that posterity our Constitution speaks so profoundly of.
Are there other questions? Yes, sir, here in the back.
This question is for Steve Moore. Well, it's for the panel. But as a libertarian and as an economist, the drug war. When you hear conservatives kind of talk about, well, if we just increase more drug laws, that'll take drug dealers off the street. Do you kind of see it as a kind of a hypocrisy on the right? Because the same way we can say to the left, well, gun laws aren't going to stop gun violent crimes, and we kind of laugh at them for that. Do you kind of see the same case in the conservatives when they say if we increase drug laws, that's somehow going to reduce the amount of drugs we have in our society?
It's a tough question. I am kind of libertarian when it comes to drug laws, and I've always strongly supported decriminalizing drug use. Although I have to say, what's happening in Colorado has given me some pause on this. I mean, it's not a good story what's happening in Colorado. More and more young people are using drugs, and it's disrupting their education and so on. I mean, I'm still for decriminalizing most drug use. The one thing I would say about when Heather described what happened in the Great Depression and the fact that the crime rate fell dramatically, well, that's in part because we ended prohibition, right? And ending prohibition had a huge impact in reducing crime rates in the United States. So I don't know. I mean, I'm actually quite of a mixed mind on where we go with this right now. There's a number of states this year, in November, that are going to be voting on legalization of marijuana, and I'm kind of undecided. How about you guys?
Well, this is a cop-out. I'm still kind of agnostic about drug criminalization, and most police chiefs and officers who I know are not in favor of it, and that's because, again, they are channeling what they hear from their communities. Now, the libertarian can always say, well, the reason people that live with open-air drug trade feel that it is so threatening to them and they want the dealers in prison is because we've criminalized it. And if we can just decriminalize it, everything will go away, and that'll solve the problem. I'm just not so sure. And I also do not buy the argument that somehow we are forcing poor minority men to sell drugs because that's the only opportunity available to them. That's simply not the case. That's an insult to people, the many, many thousands of law-abiding inner-city residents who are opting to work in the legal economy rather than the illegal economy. And again, it's a matter, really, as far as I'm concerned, of values and self-control. Do you believe in work? Do you believe in pulling yourself up through the proper channels which are still available?
I think that's a great question to kind of end the panel on, because my research on economic mobility for the Pew Foundation said there's two things that cause people that are in the middle class or higher to fall down. Why are you climbing down the economic ladder, so to speak? And those two reasons are drug use, and the second is the breakdown of the family. Which kind of brings back to what we talked about, that really opportunity and culture do go hand in hand. And so we look forward to figuring out how are policies that we can look at creating more economic opportunity through reforms of the tax code, labor laws, and then working, as Chuck mentioned, to say how can we make sure that what we're not doing any harm to marriage, and try to look and say how can we encourage people to form new families through the institution of marriage, and obviously continue the great success we've had during crime. So I'd like to thank you all for the event, for the first annual Index of Culture and Opportunity. So we look forward to kind of hoping see how things have improved and changed next year for the new 2015 report. So thank you all for y'all's attendance, and thank you to Chuck Donovan of the Charlotte Luzier Institute, Heather McDonald from Manhattan, and Steve Moore, Chief Economist at Heritage. Thank y'all all.
Thanks, Rick.